All right.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. So I'm Luke.
And I'm Aaron.
And Aaron and I have a few things in common. We're both dads. We both have a fair bit of Ember experience under our belts at this point. We both help maintain Ember CLI deploy, which is why we're here today. And we both live in the best city in the world.
London. We nailed it. And to be fair, to full disclosure, Luke and I only met each other this morning, so what could go wrong with this presentation, hey? So we're here to talk to you about Ember CLI deploy. Where is it at the moment? It's 0.4.x. This was announced by Luke at EmberCamp at the start of the year, and we released it in April 2015. It was a really good sort of test bed for understanding how people want to use this sort of thing. So some of the things we got right there was we ended up with a core plus an adapter sort of ecosystem, which was awesome, and some pretty good documentation. But what we also found was it was quite prescriptive and not very flexible. One of the things we realized was even though Ember itself is all about conventions, deployment doesn't really fit into that category, and it's quite custom to people's needs. And 0.4 was very specific to one particular deployment scenario, which didn't necessarily fit with everyone else's. 0.5 had some goals that we sort of got from that. Our goals are to more flexibly support multiple varied deployment scenarios, have easy to write plugins, give some good documentation around that, and really make it easy for people to write their own plugins for the deployment, and have some real composability between plugins so you can get that flexibility and improve the configuration story.
Yeah, getting out 0.4 was really an exercise of this new team working together for the first time. And so when we started to set our sights on 0.5, we had a little experience together, and we started to form some more ambitious goals. And so we went back to kind of core principles, and you think there's an agile engineering practice that came out of Kent Beck's Extreme Programming book that talks about having a really clear metaphor for the system that you're building. And so when we thought about this for the deployment scenario, we thought, what could be clearer than a deployment pipeline? Seems like a real good fit to kind of bake into the deepest level of what we were working on. And so a pipeline consists of hooks, and then plugins implement one or more of those hooks. And we can look at this visually. So the pipeline has a beginning that starts at the beginning of your deploy, and it has an end that goes to the end of the deploy. And the pipeline consists of a series of hooks. These are, you can think of as the named stages of the deploy. And so we identified kind of the major hooks, build, prepare, and upload. And we said, okay, plugins will execute at one of these hooks. We quickly, as we started writing the first plugins to explore this idea, we quickly realized that almost every plugin also needed something in the beginning around configuration. So we said, okay, there's a configuration hook that's really important. And the fact is that there's more hooks than these in the real project, and we'll look at those later. But for now, we're going to start with this simplified model to just kind of learn how it works. So we've kind of foreshadowed 0.5 at EmberCamp in March, and I would say since the summer, people have been asking us, so when is it ready? Robert Jackson, I'm looking at you. And the answer in open source to when it's ready is when it's done. Because we're all volunteers here,
Luke,
promising.
Luke,
yeah.
I actually did it at lunchtime. It shipped.
You released it.
Yeah.
Well, I take that back. So, can we see it in action?
Yeah, let's do it. That's what we're here for, isn't it?
Fantastic.
Yeah. So before we do actually look at it in action, there's a couple of things that you need to really think about before using Ember CLI deploy. Before actually installing it, you need to actually understand what your deployment strategy is. A bit like when you're building your Ember app, you need to know what you want it to do before you can install plugins or search for plugins that you need. It's the same way. You need to understand kind of where you want your files to sit, how you want it to be done. Do you want them to be gzipped? And in order to know what plugins to use. So there's no real quick start guide to Ember CLI deploy because you need to understand your own deployment scenario. So there are many scenarios out there, but I guess Luke has sort of coined one that's pretty well known these days. So maybe if you just want to explain that a little.
Sure. This is the deployment scenario I would like us to implement today. I want to build my app for production, so I want it minimized. I want assets gzipped, uploaded to S3. So I want to serve the assets via CloudFront, off of S3, and then I want to take the HTML and I want to put it up into a Redis store, and then be able to have multiple revisions of the app available at any given point in time. So I can serve up kind of one active one, and then maybe one as a preview before I show it to my users.
Cool. Sounds like a plan. So
All
we're gonna go with deploying the Lightning strategy. So we want to run you through what that actually looks like with 0.5.0. So let's install Ember CLI deploy first. You'll see one of the things
data anymore. Yes.
You'll see one of the first things. The blueprint here will give you a configuration file. It sits right next to your environment.js. So we'll have a look at that first. It'll look quite familiar to everyone. It basically is a file that returns a function, which contains a configuration object there. It's passed in a deploy target. So we can see that the build plugin is being configured by default here, because we figure everyone's going to need to build their project. And based on what the deploy target is there, we are setting the build environment.
A quick word about semantics here. In 0.4, we called this environment, the thing that's deploy target there. It was very confusing because even though you probably refer to within your company and team, you refer to deployment environments, production, QA, et cetera, Ember CLI has its own idea of an environment. And so we were getting very confused, even ourselves, between Ember CLI's environment and the environment you're deploying to. So we said, hey, scratch it, new name, deploy target. So all throughout Ember CLI deploy 0.5, deploy target, it refers to the place where you're deploying.
Cool. So let's execute the deployment. So basically, Ember deploy, that's all you need. And we can see here we've got some new output that sort of explains what the pipeline is doing. But we get a nice little warning message first, because Ember CLI deploy by itself doesn't do anything. You need to install some plugins. So when you do run it the first time like this, without plugins, you'll get a message. So what should we look at doing first for this deployment strategy?
We should build the app first off.
That's a good idea. Just give me a second. I'll just install a plugin for that.
You type really well without your hands.
Yeah, I've been practicing. So we have a plugin for that called Ember CLI deploy build.
All right, so before we keep going, I want to talk about the anatomy of a plugin. What does it consist of? First off, it's going to have a common name, so Ember CLI deploy dash whatever. Second off, a Ember CLI deploy plugin is an Ember CLI add-on. Now, this is pretty awesome, and the reason that it's awesome is because that means that you already know how to use it. So without me even telling you, you know how to install an Ember CLI deploy plugin. If you need to debug it, you know where the code is on disk. You know that it's also an NPM package, and that how it's versioned, where the version number is, where you can look to see its dependencies, et cetera. So pretty cool stuff. It has, in order for Ember CLI deploy to identify it, it has a keyword in the package.json keyword section, similar to Ember add-ons. That's the keyword there in italics. We'll see it again later. And it has one required API that it implements, which is a method called create deploy plugin, which needs to return an object with one or more methods in that object. When that method matches the name of a hook that's executing, it runs. Let's take a look at that.
Yeah.
So we can see the basic file structure of an add-on here. And if we go ahead and open up the package.json, we can see, again, pretty standard package.json for an add-on. In the keyword section, we see this new keyword, Ember CLI deploy plugin. Again, that's used for auto discovery. So there's no real configuration once you do Ember install of a plugin. Ember CLI deploy just sees that it's there, starts using it for you. Let's see, should we try the build again?
This is index.js.
Yes, okay. So this is the index.js of this build plugin. And you'll notice that it implements this build function. And because there's a hook named build, this is the function that's going to run at that stage of the pipeline. And it receives a context object, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And it also extends here on line 13 from a deploy plugin base class, which we've developed to make it really easy to write plugins. You can extend from it, get a bunch of stuff for free, which again, we'll address a little bit later too. Let's try to run this again.
Yeah, let's do it.
So we're now running the deploy pipeline with the build plugin in it.
Yep. So you can see here at the top here, the build plugin has registered functions against the configure and the build hook. Next, it's coming down to the configure hook that it's running, and it's validating some config. We move down to the build hook where we're building the files. This is just using Ember CLI's default build under the covers. And then finally, it's just the rest of the hooks. So you can get a pretty good idea of what's going on in that pipeline.
And a quick note about the output that you're seeing here. This is the verbose output from Ember CLI deploy 0.5. When you run it without a -- verbose flag, you'll see a much more succinct step. But this is awesome if you want to kind of understand what's happening, what hooks are running, and what plugins are running on each of the hooks.
So let's just have a look at what we end up with in the directory there. It's very familiar to what you'd expect in that temp directory. We've got a deployed dist directory, and there's all our standard files that you get from an Ember CLI deploy build. So in that first run, what do we have? We have a build plugin installed. It's implemented the configure hook, where it's validated config, and it's implemented the build hook, where it's actually built the files. So what do we want to look at next? What's next in the pipeline?
Well, we want to deploy our assets to S3.
Yeah.
But there's one thing we should probably do before that, which is we're going to be serving our assets off of a different domain than our HTML. And by default, Ember CLI is going to build our HTML with just a relative reference.
Yeah.
So we want to specify that domain there.
Yeah. So this is something that I've got lots of questions about. So
yeah. So you'll notice right here, lines 13 and 14, where there's a style sheets, and down here in 21 and 22 is the JS. It's just asset/vendor and the fingerprint. So it's good that this is fingerprinted. Those files are minified, which is great, but we don't want a relative reference. So what we can do is just open up Ember CLI build.js and modify the fingerprint options, which tells Broccoli Asset Rev to prepend this domain, this path before each of those things. And so we can do that and try this again.
There's nothing special here. This is a standard Ember CLI feature.
Nothing special about Ember CLI deploy in this particular aspect.
So let's run the deploy again. And we'll check the paths on the index file.
And there we go. Cool. All right, so now I think we can move on to S3.
Yeah, so we want to go to S3.
Yeah, let's do it.
Guess what? There's a plugin for that as well.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, it's called Ember CLI deploy S3. Let's install it.
You know what? We're going to need a S3 bucket.
Yep, cool. Make sure you do that. Again, this kind of iterates that it's not a matter of just plugging and playing. You need to think about your deployment. If I'm going to deploy to S3, I need to set up an S3 bucket myself at this stage.
So we just created the bucket in the EU West 1 region, which is exciting for me because I've never created a bucket in EU West 1.
Welcome to Ireland.
And so we're going to make sure that we need to specify that. So that was been one of the biggest kind of stumbling blocks that we've seen in the wild in 0.4 is if you have the wrong region specified in your deployment scenario, the upload doesn't work and the error is sort of obtuse.
I think we need to make that a required config if anyone wants to raise a pull request against that plugin. Feel free. So now we need to configure our S3 plugin.
Yeah, so we're going to take a look, and we've pre-filled this for you. So we can see on lines 8 through 11, this is the configuration for the S3 plugin. And so we now have on line 5 build plugin configuration, which is empty and then updated down below, and on line 7 the S3 configuration. So there's a one-to-one mapping between plugin and top-level properties of the object that you're returning in this config file. So it's a very kind of clean convention here. You'll also notice on lines 8 and 9 that we're accessing process.env environment variable name. This file is processed by node, so you have access to any node, node goodness that you'd like to do. If you need to read from the file system, read from your environment variables, you can do that. And this is a good practice. This is a file that you want to commit to Git, but you don't want to have your secret credentials committed to Git.
And one of the common questions that we'd often get with 0.4 is like, can we use ember.cli.env? And for whatever reason, it was quite difficult to do, but we've actually baked that functionality in out of the box. So if you drop a .env.deploy target file into your project root, it'll read those by default.
So before we run this deploy, I want to take a look at the implementation of the S3 plugin to see how these configuration variables are kind of declared and defined. So let's go ahead and we'll open up the index.js file. this plugin. And so we can see that we're extending again from deploy plugin base. And we've got this starting on line 15, we have our default config. So we're requiring, we're defining some default configuration values, some of which are strings and static values, scalar values, and some of which are functions. When it's a function, it's going to execute at runtime. So this is one of the keys to plugin composability and plugins collaborating with each other. Then down here on line 38, we are listing our required config. If one of these things is missing, then Ember CLI is going to stop right there and give you a useful error.
Yep. And we've realized, so the default config and the required config come from this base plugin that we've created. So we've realized that a common thing that all plugins seem to need to do is validate the configuration in the configure hook. So we've given you this kind of DSL, I guess, to easily define what they are, and that'll happen by default for you. So let's run the deploy. So we see we've had some things validated, and the upload hook here, the S3 plugin has uploaded some files for us.
So let's see if they're really there.
Yeah, let's see. It's looking good. Hey, it works.
Nice.
Awesome. There they are.
Excellent. So our S3 plugin implemented two hooks, the configure hook and the upload hook.
Yep.
There we go. So what did we learn here, Aaron?
We basically learn in the configuration file there's a one-to-one mapping from that top level object in the configuration object that's passed back and your plugin. So basically take the plugin name minus the Ember CLI deploy, and that's what your configuration object is. You can use environment variables in a .env file or however you like to do it. And one of the key things is make sure for now that you set your region, because if it's not the US East 1, then it's going to fail on you with a very unhelpful message.
So next, I think we should look at uploading the HTML to Redis.
Yeah, guess what?
What do you think?
There's a plugin for that as well.
Nice.
So we'll install that quickly, and we'll run the deploy again. So it looks like that the index HTML was uploaded to Redis. So let's just
So we didn't even configure a Redis. Like, how did it do that?
By default, it's going to hit localhost. Again, we could pop some config in the deploy.js, point it to a URL for another Redis instance, but for this case, localhost is enough.
Sounds
so
good.
Let's just have a look at what we actually get inside Redis. We'll open it up. What you can see here is we have two keys currently. We have EmberCamp index default and EmberCamp index revisions. So basically, revisions is a list of the last 10 things that have been deployed. You can customize that. And EmberCamp index default is basically the contents of your index HTML file.
So if all I wanted to do is to have kind of one active version of my app read, I could read from this Redis key and on my web server, send it down, and I'm good.
Yep.
But if we want to have more, if we want to have multiple revisions, then we'll need something else.
Exactly.
Right?
Every time you deploy with this current default setup, you will be overriding the last revision.
Got it.
So what do we see here? The Redis plugin, again, it implemented a configure hook, and it also implemented the upload hook, just like S3. And so we saw the default key that was used, but before using default, it will actually look in the context object, which we'll cover in a couple of slides coming, but essentially it's looking for a property on this object that's passed to it called revision_data.revision_key. So it tries to use that, and if it doesn't find it, it uses the default one. So where do you think we might get a revision key from, Luke?
There's a plugin for that.
There is. What do you think it's called?
I'm going to go with Ember CLI deploy revision data.
Perfect, yeah, coming right up. Installed.
NPM is performing very well today.
I know it is, it is. Yeah, we're tempting the demo gods, but we're winning so far.
So we'll notice here that the revision data plugin has generated a revision during the prepare hook.
Which we missed.
It was up there. And that Redis has now used that to generate, to upload to a particular key instead of default, here where you see that hash right there. Mm-hmm. So can we take another look at Redis and see what happened there?
Yep.
And there it is. Cool.
Cool.
So the revision data plugin implemented the configure hook, as well as the prepare hook, which then somehow the Redis plugin was able to use that information. So let's take a look at how that happened.
Sure. So basically, there's this idea of a context. It's basically an object that's passed to every single hook function that a plugin implements. So as it goes down the pipeline, this context object's passed to a function, and if that hook function returns an object, that will be merged into the context. So you can see in this case, the revision data plugin has returned an object which contains property revision data.revision key, and that's merged into the context. That context then is passed on to every other plugin hook for the rest of the pipeline. So this is a really great way for allowing plugins to communicate with each other. So what about gzipping assets?
There's a plugin for that?
There is. What if we want to manifest so we don't upload things that are already on S3?
I hate that. I hate that. Yeah, so we should have a plugin for that too.
We should. And guess what? We do. Yeah. So let's install both of those. And run another deploy. So here, it's basically a full deploy. So if we have a look what happens, we can see that, when we get back to the top, we can see that all our plugins have registered themselves against the different hooks within the pipeline. The pipeline runs the configure hook, starts validating all the config for each of the plugins as we go. Get down to the prepare hook. The build hook, we build all the files. The prepare hook, the revision data plugin creates the key. We gzip our assets in the will upload hook. Manifest is created. Assets are uploaded to S3. Index HTML is uploaded to Redis. And then we're done. Our pipeline finishes, and we have an app deployed. So in this case, the manifest plugin and the gzip plugin both implemented the configure hook. They also implemented this other hook that we haven't spoken about yet. So as we said, these are sort of some main hooks, but we actually have a whole number of hooks. And this one the naming, we've tried to keep this similar to what you will see in your Ember app. So where we have, say, an upload hook, we also have a will upload and a did upload. Will prepare, did prepare, will build, and did build. So it allows you to hook into very fine-grained stages within that pipeline. What happened there? Next one. So when you run ember deploy, this is actually what happens. This is the list of all the plugins, all the hooks, and they run in this order. So you can see from the start we can configure, we can hook into setup. Will deploy sort of wraps the whole deployment. You've got your will build, did build, your prepare hooks, your upload hooks, and your did deploy and tear down.
So this is looking really good, but I feel like there's a step that we missed, which is we deployed a revision, and I'm able to preview it, but if I want to activate that revision, how would I go about doing that?
Yeah, so ember deploy is not the only command that we provide. There's a couple of others. So one of them is ember deploy list. So what this will do is hit Redis. It runs a different hook here, display revisions and fetch revisions. And it will go to Redis and find out what all your current revisions are and display them. Once we know that, we can run ember deploy activate and pass it in one of these revision numbers, and it will go activate that particular revision for you.
So can we list out those again?
Yeah, we're listing them again now. So here you can see, here's our list of revisions, and we have a little arrow next to the one that's been activated. I think if we're going to go through and do it again. So we're now going to activate a different version. So now the second one's activated. If we jump into Redis, now we'll actually see that there's a new key here. There's EmberCamp index current. So we have a number of different revisions, and the current, it's gone. The current one basically is a key that points to another revision key to say it's the active one. So you could implement a web server that maybe inspects Redis, finds out what the active version is and returns it. Otherwise, maybe inspect a query parameter and then find a particular version.
So when Aaron ran ember deploy :activate, we can go to the next slide. We wanted to keep the metaphor that we talked about kind of consistent throughout Ember CLI deploy. And so ember deploy :activate runs a pipeline. And these are the steps, these are the hooks in that pipeline. And you'll notice that some of them are similar to, it's the same as the other ones. And some of them, these will activate, activate, did activate, are new that didn't exist in the standard deploy pipeline.
Yep, and when we run ember deploy activate, again, this is the same set of hooks that you saw before, but because we passed the -- activate flag in, we also include the activate hooks. So there's a few extra ones you can
So
hook into there.
this is the use case of I want to deploy and activate in one fell swoop. And this was probably, besides the S3 region issue, this was probably the number one thing that
Yep.
people contacted us
Definitely,
about
definitely.
in
So you can
0.4.
do it.
Right. So this is awesome, but, the slide's stole my thunder. There are a lot of plugins to install and to keep up to date. Like we're up to 6 plugins in our package JSON file. I don't know. Is there something we could do about this?
There is one more thing.
Yeah,
There
one more thing.
is, yeah. Yeah. Can you guess what it is?
It's a plugin.
It is a plugin.
All right.
Sort of.
So meet the plugin pack. And a plugin pack is a plugin that packages up a number of other plugins. It has those plugins as dependencies and automatically pulls them in. And so the maintainer of the plugin pack takes responsibility for identifying the suite of plugins that are going to work well together and the versions that are working well together. For a particular deployment strategy, and it's going to really ease the amount of installation hassle and maintenance that you need for that. So do we have a plugin pack we can show them?
We do. First of all, I think I'll go in. I'm going to delete all the current plugins that we've created from package JSON. I'm going to remove them from node modules. And then we're going to install the plugin pack, and hopefully our deploy works just like it did before. So you can see here, now we've only got Ember CLI deploy and Ember CLI deploy lightning pack. So let's run the deploy one more time.
Sounds good.
Boom. Everything just worked.
Looks just like before. Fantastic.
It does. Awesome.
That is pretty cool.
We're pretty stoked about that feature.
Yeah, plugin packs are pretty awesome.
Yeah.
So what are the use cases for plugin packs? There's this one, which we just showed you. This is sort of, I imagine, like it's a community-supported Lightning pack. This one is supported by the Ember CLI deploy core team. You can imagine the community supporting things around Azure or Google Cloud or other very common deployment targets. But of course, in all of our companies, the bigger the company especially, the more esoteric our needs become around deployment. And so quickly, by show of hands, how many people have more than one Ember app that they maintain? Okay, so I would say somewhere about between a third and half of the room. And for those of you who do that, I would suspect that your deployment pattern is the same for those multiple Ember apps. They certainly are for us. And so the other big use case that I'm seeing for plugin packs is that you create Ember CLI deploy Zapnito, Ember CLI deploy Yap, which then you use in each one of your Ember apps. You basically now have one place to maintain your deployment infrastructure, and when you update it, you just update that version of that plugin pack across all of your apps.
That's it. So we released 0.5.0. We've obviously got a few plugins there. You might wonder, is that about it? But surprisingly enough, we've got a pretty good ecosystem already of plugins. You can see a bunch of them on the left. JSON config, which we didn't use. SSH tunnel for if you need to SSH. These are maintained by the core team. And on the right, we've got a bunch of community maintained plugins allowing you to notify Firebase, git tag, push your source maps up to Sentry. So it's pretty amazing already. We've got people using these. We're using most of these ones on the left-hand side and some of these in production on multiple apps every day.
I predict this one's going to be very popular.
It
Ember
is,
CLI
it is.
deploy Slack.
Yeah,
It's
awesome.
Pretty cool.
Along with that, we've put a real ditch effort into documentation. If you go to ember-cli-deploy.com, we've got a pretty good GitHub pages documentation site there, which kind of goes through what a deployment pipeline is, what a deployment strategy is, what to think about, how to write plugins and all that sort of stuff. We've put a lot of effort in there, thanks to a couple of the guys on the core team over the last few weeks. So check that out. Hopefully it's got everything you need to let you know how to get going.
Yeah, and in particular on the docs, I want to call out Mattia and Sam, who have done a great job. Mattia's up here in the front today. Sam's in New York, couldn't make it to EmberCamp. But together with Aaron and I, Michael Klein, Sam Selikoff, Mattia Geta have really pushed this project forward along with contribution from a bunch of other folks. But there was a big push thanks to EmberCamp being on the calendar to get this done.
Conference-driven development.
Conference-driven development, exactly. So There's also, we have a exciting announcement today, which is that there's a gentleman who's been working a lot on helping Ember CLI deploy work well with the Windows ecosystem. In fact, I think he may be the only developer with a Windows laptop here today. So we're really happy to announce, and he doesn't know we're doing this, that Pepijn Schoen is a new member of the Ember CLI deploy core team. Welcome, Pepijn. And thank you to you guys and to everybody else who's contributed to this ecosystem and who will contribute moving forward.
Thanks very much, guys. So I guess as well as thanking the individual contributors for helping out there are a couple of companies, Zapnito and Yap Labs, that have sponsored some of the work into Ember CLI Deploy and the plugins, which was really, really helpful and helps it to get where it's going. It's this sort of sponsorship in building this sort of stuff that allows us to have a really amazing ecosystem, and hopefully we can keep pushing that and making it amazing. So thanks a lot to these guys here. So what does the future hold? Basically, the future starts today with your ideas. Come and talk to myself and Luke, Mattia and Pepijn. Let us know your suggestions, your advice, questions, all that sort of stuff. We love talking about this, so we'd love to hear your thoughts and whether you think it's helpful or not. And if you've got any good advice, that'd be amazing. And tomorrow, as a team, we're going to have our first face-to-face. So it's the first time we've all met in person, so it's a pretty fun time, and we're going to catch up and hopefully talk about what the future holds. As for that, that's about all from us from Ember London.
And Ember NYC.
Yeah, thanks
Thanks everybody.
for listening.